Share via email. Report story. Chapter 9. Five pro heroes showed up at the scene only minutes after the ambulances had come back with All Might. The fight was pretty much over at that point, but with the help of the heroes, the police were able to apprehend the villain and get him loaded into a special cruiser heading for police custody. Despite the grim tone, the students were quietly celebrating their victory over the villain, congratulating one another and checking to make sure that none of the wounds were too severe. The only one who was not celebrating was Izuku. At first, he felt the same relieving joy that everyone else felt, his pale face regaining some of its color as the fear drained from him and the adrenaline turned into excitement. He looked up and smiled at his peers who looked back at him with matching expressions. But then Izuku looked to Iida and saw his face agape with shock. Izuku looked behind him to see Ochako laying on the ground a few feet away. Izuku had managed to catch her when they had tumbled from the villain's grasp, but when they had landed, they had been unbalanced, so they had both been flung to the ground and separated. Fear struck Izuku's heart like a spear and he scrambled to meet her. Her legs were twisted in odd directions from the fall, and the bullet wound in her side, which had not been as severe before, was now a lot deeper, blood pooling into the grass and coiling around her splayed hair. Izuku flailed in the grass until his legs finally managed to work properly and propel him towards her. He skidded to her side and used gentle hands to lift her into his lap. He gazed at her face, tears streaming down his face. "Ochako," he whispered. No answer. "Ochako, come on, we have to get back to the dorms before Izawa kicks our asses. We are out just a little bit past curfew, don't you think?" Still no answer. "Come on, Ochako," Izuku cried out. He leaned down and placed his ear against her chest. He waited, and waited, and waited. Nothing. There was no gentle rise and fall of her chest, no soft scratch of her breath. Her breath was not faint, it was non-existent. Izuku's eyes widened and tears rained down his cheeks. He snapped his head up and howled into the early morning. "No, no, not Ochako. No, please don't take her, oh god no." The other students were frozen in shock, only Iida able to force his legs to take 2 steps before he crashed to the ground and landed on his knees in the dewy grass. Ignoring the stares of his friends, the efforts of the police to load students into the ambulances, and even the stare of his mentor and hero, All Might, Izuku laid Ochako on the grass and began to administer CPR. Plugging her nose, he pressed his lips to hers and forced air into her lungs, lifting his head for a few seconds before repeating the action. The heroes that had arrived at the scene were stunned for a moment, but soon All Might, Best Jeanist, and Gunhead all rushed to Ochako's side, only Endeavor and Gang Orca remaining behind to help get the ambulances prepared to take students away. The three pro heroes raced to Izuku and Ochako, All Might reaching Izuku first while Gunhead and Best Jeanist leaned down to examine Ochako. Izuku ignored all of them and placed his hands on her chest, pressing down in quick pumping motions in an effort to get her heart beating again. Luckily for Izuku, Aizawa had given the class a lesson in first aid just a few weeks ago which had included how to properly give CPR to a victim hanging onto life by a thread. With each pump of his hands on her chest, he whispered her name through gritted teeth. Ochako, Ochako, Ochako. Come on, young Midoriya, All Might said, his voice cracking despite his efforts to stifle it. We can't do anything for her now. A tear slid down All Might's cheek as he said the last sentence. His heart was breaking both for the strong heroine in training as well as his broken successor. He leaned down and grasped Izuku's shoulders, trying to ease him to his feet. Promoted stories. You'll also like. Free. Onishots 149K3K. This is a collections of free. Readers. Requests on this are now closed. After all. Fluke 11.4K802. Will edit once I'm free. N. This is a work of fiction, and any similarity with other works is purely coincidental. Excuse grammatical errors and misspellings, Eng. The heroes return MHAXJJK, ongoing 115K 1.7K and quad. Izuku. Midoriya, after being betrayed and killed, vanishes leaving hurt people behind. After 2 months and a half, he come back, changed. How will the class Return of Mokuten discontinued 3.5K45. This story is officially up for adoption. If anyone is interested, message me or comment on the story. Zero Deku Onishots 31.5K798. Because of circumstances, this book won't be continued unfortunately. Feel free to check out my other stuff. Thank you for understanding. I am sequel of UR check mark 69.4K 1.8K. This book is the sequel of You Are So Better. Read that first before going here. Tears of joy. Tears of joy. Thank you to that one reader that suggested this title. I can't see you sad face, but thank you. Feelings. Aizawa. X-Reader 57.2K 1.3K RE posting. This until I edit it. Sorry if it's not good, it's my first time writing a story. You enroll at UA and you have multiple quirks you are really good at using. Why? Izuku ripped away from his hero, his face set with fury, guilt, and intense grief as tears streamed down his face in rivers. No, Izuku said with a deadly calm. I refuse to give up on her. He gulped and looked up at the students and heroes assembled. I refuse to lose today. He remembered the first time he had said those words when he and Ochako had been waiting to enter the practice building for combat training against Bakugo and Iida. He remembered how Ochako had helped him through his anxiety and had fought at his side even though the prospect of fighting two very talented students had seemed frightening. The memory gave him courage, gave him hope. He leaned down again, abandoning the pumping technique and plugging her nose again, desperately hoping that his training would prevail here, that he would not lose his best friend for life. After repeating this for several seconds, he immediately went back to pumping his hands on her chest. He could feel her ribs pressed up against his calloused hands and he pushed harder, hoping with every press that the thumping of her heart would restart beneath those ribs. I am here, Ochako, and I am not leaving you, Izuku said, his voice breaking. Come back to me. He leaned his entire weight into each press, his labored breathing filling the silence as the students watched. The pro-heroes did not try to stop Izuku, although all of them knew how to administer CPR. None of them were rescue heroes, and to them, Izuku was doing a rather good job despite the fact that Ochako seemed to be getting colder and colder by the minute. Suddenly, Izuku just broke down. His sobs and screams echoed throughout the valley, but nobody tried to comfort him. Everyone just allowed him to shout his anger and grief to the world. He pulled Ochako off of the ground and held her to him, his arms wrapped protectively around her as he sobbed into her neck. Ochako, I'm so sorry. Why? Izuku had to pause as more sobs racked his body. I failed you as a friend, as a hero, and as a guardian. He sobbed again. I was supposed to keep you safe, I was supposed to be there for you and I let you get. You did not fail me, Deku. The voice was so soft that he thought he had imagined it at first, but the words clanged in his mind like a savior bell. He pulled her away from his chest and looked at her face, his eyes searching wildly over her face and her body, surprise coursing through him. He realized that he had been sobbing so hard that he had not felt her breathing restart. Get an ambulance now. Gunhead yelled at the nearest student, his voice filled with relieved urgency. Iida, who had been sobbing on his knees, now shot up like a rocket and bolted in the direction of the other heroes and the police, waving his arms and screaming at them to send help. Ochako. Oh my god, Ochako, you're alive. Izuku sobbed joyfully, holding her to him, one hand cradling her lower back while the other was pressed against her bullet wound to stifle the bleeding. She groaned at the pain his touch to her wound brought, but she also leaned into his body, both of her hands finding their way around his neck until she was clinging to him in an embrace just tight enough to show their affection but also light enough that it didn't bring her too much pain. All Might and Gunhead were also comforting one another as tears streamed down the faces of the popular heroes and the students assembled were all holding each other with relief as the news of Ochako's survival spread amongst the classmates. Iida returned only a few seconds later, followed by Endeavor, Gang Orca and 3 ambulances. The heroes did not speak as they opened up the backs of the trucks and prepared a stretcher. Meanwhile, one of the doctors who had come with the extra ambulances was trying to separate Izuku and Ochako. The doctor was holding onto Izuku's shoulders and was trying to get him to stand up. Come on, you need rest and a checkup, young man, the doctor said as he tugged once more on Izuku's shoulders. You are in pretty bad condition yourself. Quote dot. I want to stay with Ochako, Izuku said, unrelenting. But, a small explosion popped on the meadow floor and thin black smoke rose into the air in loose curls. The doctor snapped his head in the direction of the explosion to see an angry Bakugo standing in a loose fighting stance, his hands half curled into fists so that sparks could fly from his palms. Everyone froze except for Kirishima, who held an arm out in front of his boyfriend. Isn't it obvious that Deku doesn't want to be separated from his girlfriend? He's not that injured, trust me, I've seen him when he's hurt. He will survive, but right now, you are hurting him more by trying to keep him from the person he loves. He just saved her life, can't you give the damned nerd a fucking break? The doctor's face paled and he released Izuku's shoulders. He stood up shakily and nodded once to Bakugo and once to Izuku before turning and beckoning for Izuku to follow him to the ambulance. Izuku stood up with Ochako curled in his arms and turned to follow the doctor, but paused. He looked to Bakugo with a bright red face and smiled at him before walking towards the ambulance. Bakugo flipped him off in response, but after a moment, the corners of his mouth twitched upward ever so slightly. Blank, underscore, blank. Izuku had been dozing on and off for the past 3 days, his body refusing to fully fall asleep as he slept in the hospital. He had been given a quick checkup, but other than that he had not left Ochako's side, sitting at her bedside day and night. He had been blocked from seeing her as she underwent surgery to remove the bullet and to fix her broken legs, but afterward he had been permitted to stay with her. Izuku was used to being in a hospital, and so despite his severe need to be with her, he remained polite and accommodating to whatever the doctors and nurses needed of him, therefore earning their trust. The hospital staff began to really like Izuku and would allow him to stay with Ochako even when normal guests would not have normally been able to. They also liked to give him snacks from the vending machine when he looked particularly worn out. Izuku entered Ochako's room and sank into a chair by her bedside after taking a break to go to the bathroom and talk to Ochako's parents about her condition. Her parents had been at the hospital minutes after she had arrived, waiting with Izuku for her surgery to end and waiting in her room for 2 whole days while she recovered. They had left late in the afternoon the day before to tend to work. Ochako's family did not have a lot of money, so even despite their daughter's condition, They had to go home to continue working at their construction business. Izuku's own mother had also called, who had joined All Might in visiting him to make sure that he was not only physically alright but also mentally stable. His mother had eventually declared him to be alright after hugging and kissing him for 2 hours and asking him questions to make sure he was okay. He had called her earlier that day to let her know that he was still alright. Once Izuku was settled into his designated chair by her bedside, he looked at Ochako. She looked much better now that she had gotten the care she needed from the hospital, but it was still difficult to see her like this, still slightly broken and healing in a hospital bed, covered in wrappings and bandages. His eyes wandered over her pretty face and down to her shoulders where the sheets of the bed covered the rest of her wrapped body. His eyes eventually fell onto her hand, which was lying palm up beside where her hips were beneath the covers and wrappings. Izuku hesitated but took a deep breath and placed his hand in hers. Her hand was so soft and warm. He suddenly craved that warmth, that feeling that she was alive and active and full of energy. He forced himself to sit still as the wave of want washed over him. He shook his head. He was being selfish for even thinking like this. He shoved his feelings for her down as far as he could press them and gave her hand a small squeeze. He had been so focused on trying to shove his feelings down that he didn't even notice that she was awake until he felt a small squeeze in return. He jolted in his seat, his eyes widening, all of his tiredness was forgotten. Hey Deku, am I late for training? Ochako asked him in a whisper. Izuku's mouth sat agape as he looked from her teasing smile to his hand in hers and back again. Yuyur, how are you? Izuku could not find the words as tears pricked at the corners of his eyes. He squeezed her hand again. You're awake, he commented, a few tears trickling down his cheeks as he looked into her eyes. They had a light spark in them again, their chocolatey brown color swirling with emotions, emotions that were not full of pain for the first time in the past couple days. Izuku placed his other hand on top of the one already holding her hand and looked her full in the face, his happiness making him feel weak as he told himself over and over again that she was okay. I'm okay Deku, Ochako said as she looked into his face and saw the mass of relief there. It was a close call but I'm okay now. She smiled at him. He nodded and closed his eyes for a moment. Can you help me sit up a little bit? His eyes opened again and he smiled at her. Of course. He leaned down and pressed a button on the control pad beside her bed until she was in more of a sitting position. She turned her body to face him just a little bit, and when he sat up, he found himself looking right into her face which was now so full of life as it had been before the attack. He cleared his throat as the heat rose in his cheeks and he looked at the ceiling. Izuku. His eyes snapped to meet hers, the surprise of her using his real name lighting up his face. Thank you for saving me. I didn't save you, I failed you. Izuku hung his head. I should have been there for you when we were attacked. I should have been taken, not you, and I should not have let you get so close to. He gulped, he couldn't even say the word and he looked down at the ground. Death, Ochako said. Izuku's head snapped back up to look at her. Her eyes did have a tinge of fear and sorrow, but they were overwhelmed by the look of determination in her eyes. You did not fail me, she said to him, not a hint of anger or distaste in her face as she spoke. You are the sole reason why I was able to survive that villain for so long. You are the reason why I fought tooth and nail for my life no matter the consequences. We stopped that villain together and there was nothing you could have done differently to change the situation. If you had been captured instead of me, I still would have fought just as hard to get you back. Ochako leaned forward and placed a hand over her friend's heart. Thank you for saving me, she repeated. More tears spilled down Izuku's cheeks and he nodded at her. Thank you for staying with me, he whispered. He barely registered what happened. One moment he had been sitting in the chair next to her bed, his best friend comforting him, and the next moment, he was being pulled toward his friend, her hand grasping the front of his shirt as she pulled him down to meet her and rose a little in her bed to meet him. Their lips met in a soft kiss between them. He was so surprised that the moment almost went over his head, and it was over far quicker than he wished. Soon he was back in his chair, stunned and staring at Ochako with his mouth open and his eyes as white as moons. Ochako chuckled a little bit, her face bright red. Sorry, she said, her face getting even redder with embarrassment as she wondered whether she had made the right choice. Izuku looked into her eyes and saw her daring spirit fading away as it succumbed to the fear and embarrassment that was flooding her face. He did not have the words, so he just followed her lead and pulled her to him. She grunted in surprise as he pulled them together and kissed her deeper this time. When they pulled away, Izuku stood and moved to the edge of her bed to sit instead. He cupped the back of her head with one hand and held her hand with the other, their foreheads resting on one another as he stared into those gorgeous eyes of hers. Don't be. Chapter 10. Ochako was in the hospital for a solid 2 weeks before she was cleared to leave, and even then she had to leave with a single crutch. It was another week after that before she was able to return to UA to continue her hero training. She had initially feared that her future as a hero might have been broken with her injuries, but to her immense relief, her injuries healed much faster than usual thanks to the wonderful doctors and nurses at the hospital. She now entered the Hero Academia, her crutch gone along with the pain. She still walked with the slightest hint of a limp, but she didn't mind considering she thought herself lucky for even being able to walk again. She jogged down the hallways of the school towards Class 1A, her legs protesting slightly at the change of pace. She wanted to make them as strong as possible so that she wouldn't fall behind her classmates in the hero course, so she ignored the slight aching and jogged until she reached the large classroom door marked with 1A slashed down the front. She paused to catch her breath and then slid the door open. Aizawa was in the middle of lecturing his students on maneuvering in small spaces when attacking or defending against a villain when Ochako opened the door. He paused his lecture and all of the students looked in her direction. The class seemed to explode as every student rose from their seats in unison. She squeaked in surprise as all of the girls of her class hugged her at once and all of the guys crowded around her with bright smiles on their faces. Even Bakugo rose from his chair despite staying on the outer rim of the circle of teens. Sue had reached Ochako first and was holding her in a firm but careful hug that the other girls had copied around the pair. Now, the girls separated and looked at Ochako with watery smiles and eyes filled with tears. "You're back, Ribbit," Sue exclaimed with a relieved smile. "Yeah, I got out a while ago, but they just told me that I was clear to come to class," Ochako replied, finally recovering from the initial shock of being the center of attention. "I'm so glad you're okay," Kirishima and Iida said at the same time, the latter pushing through the group of girls to give his floaty friend a deep hug of his own. Aizawa let this continue for some time before sternly ordering his students to get back to their seats and give Uraraka some space. Ochako followed everyone as they flowed back to their desks and settled into her seat with a sigh behind Iida. Aizawa glanced at her and she could have sworn the corners of his mouth twitched upward a bit. "Welcome back, Uraraka, it's good to see you're feeling better." Ochako nodded to him and beamed at her teacher. He inclined his head ever so slightly to the left before turning back to the board to continue his instruction. Ochako focused everything she had on taking notes and creating lists so that she could catch up on everything she had missed. Izuku and Iida had made sure to bring her homework and notes to the hospital so that she wouldn't fall behind, even though Aizawa had excused her from any due dates, but she still didn't want to miss anything. Even so, she managed to sneak a few glances at Izuku, who sat across the classroom from her. He had stayed with her at the hospital until he was forced to go back to school, and even then he had returned every morning before school and every evening after school to sit with her and keep her company. He had come to see her with the rest of the class when she had walked in the door, but he was a lot more distant than he was when they had kissed 3 weeks ago in the hospital. It was not directed at her. She knew it was because he still blamed himself for what had happened to her, but he refused to listen even when she tried to tell him it wasn't true. She glanced over at him for the 15th time that hour and saw him glancing back at her for the first time. She smiled at him and his lips curled upwards at the corners, but he glanced away from her quickly. Ochako went back to her own notes, but she was finding it harder to focus when she was worried about him. He was just so protective, and she knew he just wanted the best for her, but he was wrong if he thought she would be better off without him in her life. Even after all she had said to him, he still believed that she was unsafe around him. After what felt like an eternity, the bell rang, signaling the end of the school day. Ochako knew that she would have to make up the material from her morning classes, but she decided on doing that later when she saw Izuku rushing to pack up his stuff. Ochako had planned for this and was already packed by the time the bell rang, so she was able to bound over to him before he could leave. "Hey Deku," Ochako said with a genuine smile at her friend. Izuku looked up in alarm and backed away a few feet. "Hello, Uraraka," he said. His voice was genuinely cheerful. He was very happy to see her, but she could see the fear in his eyes that he might hurt her again. Ochako inwardly cringed as he reverted to using her last name again. Normally this would not have been a problem, considering he had called her that since the day he had met her, but recently he had been using her first name. She secretly liked it when he did. "Want to walk with me to the dorms?" Ochako asked, shaking off the feeling of disappointment. Izuku hesitated, but when he looked up into her eyes and saw a bright sparkle there, he nodded and continued to pack up his stuff. "Great," Ochako said, pumping her fist into the air. That was a mistake. She had been fully healed, but her bullet wound still had a lingering grasp on her, and her breath hitched with slight pain as her raised arm stretched the skin on her side. Izuku's head snapped up, fear in his eyes at the sound of her gasp. "You know what, Uraraka? I think I will head out alone. I've got some work I have to do and I have to get back to the dorms quickly." He didn't wait for her reply before he ran from the classroom, a few stray tears running down his cheeks. Ochako paused by his desk. her mouth still open to tell him to wait, and her arm reached out to grab him. "But I don't want you to go," she said with a sorrowful sigh as she lowered her hand and bent down to grab her stuff. Blank, underscore, blank, underscore, 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 underscore. The time read 2:56 a.m. on her flip phone and she rubbed her eyes with exhaustion, but Ochako could not sleep. She had worked on her homework until around 11 p.m. trying to catch up on the stuff she had missed before retiring for the night, but no matter what she tried she could not coax sleep to knock her out. Every time she closed her eyes she felt the bullet strike through her side like lightning and heard the insane voice of the villain laughing at her as he ripped at her broken legs. Tears leaked out of the corners of her eyes, and although she tried to stifle them, they ran down her cheeks and landed with soft taps on her pillow with increasing frequency. Finally, Ochako sat up with an annoyed huff, admitting to herself that she would probably suffer yet another of her frequent sleepless nights. Sliding her legs over the side of the bed and hopping off and onto the floor, Ochako opened her dorm room door as silently as possible. It made the tiniest of squeaks, but she managed to open it enough for her to slip through without making too much noise. She padded barefoot down the hallway and into the common space, walking on her tiptoes to avoid waking any of her friends. Her head swam with lightheadedness and she cringed at every shadow in the dark common space, but she forced herself to the kitchenette that was attached to the main living area. She opened one of the cabinets and pulled out a large water cup. She hoped some water would help clear her head and cool her nerves. She leaned over to the faucet and poured herself a full glass of water, savoring the coolness against her finger pads. Her memory flashed back to the stifling heat of the underground lair and she gulped down the water in a desperate need to flush the memories from her system. She had drained the glass in only a few gulps and almost lunged to the sink for more. It was after her third full glass of water that she felt it. She dropped her glass and heard it shatter on the ground, but she didn't care as she bolted for the bathroom that was also attached to the common space. She barely made it to a toilet, not caring to shut or lock the door as she flung the lid open and vomited into the bowl. The white-hot memories of pain and heat and suffering came flooding through her mind with every heave. Her stomach twisted painfully and she threw up again, the villain's wicked laughter echoing in her ears. Her face felt hot, too hot. Her body felt like it was on fire and she felt like throwing herself into an ice bath. She tried to sit up but vomited again, her dinner coming up all at once. Her breathing became more and more shallow, and although she tried to remember some calming breathing exercises, the memory of her legs being stretched and snapped over and over again made her breathe so fast that she was gasping for air, searching for something to cool down her body and her mind. Rough, cool hands suddenly gripped her hair ever so lightly. She winced at the touch and almost cried out, whipping around to face the possible attacker. The sound of her cry died on her tongue as the green hair and dark freckles of her best friend came into view. She shuddered and let out a huge sigh of relief at her friend. Deku, you scared me, what are you doing up? He didn't answer, instead, he just brushed more of her hair back from her face and pulled it into his loose fist so that it was out of her face. His fingers brushed her cheeks with feather-like softness. I'm sorry, he whispered, his eyes glimmering with worry and sorrow, their green color misted over with grief. Another wave of nausea crashed over Ochako and she threw her head back over the toilet as she vomited again. And again. Suddenly she felt Izuku place his hand on her back and start to rub comforting circles between her shoulder blades. Ochako spat into the bowl, the sour taste of the vomit coating her tongue. Izuku did not speak, he just comforted her and held her hair back as she relived the horrors of her capture and torture with the villain. Finally, she dry heaved one last time and felt her stomach relax, all of its contents spilled into the toilet in front of her. She reached a shaking hand up to the handle and flushed it down, her breathing finally calming as the water cleared. Once the vomiting ended, Ochako felt all of the strength leave her body. She had been on her knees when she had been throwing her guts up, but her arms and legs now refused to hold her up. Her body started to shake violently and she felt herself slide from the edge of the toilet bowl towards the ground. But she landed in rough, strong arms. Izuku caught Ochako with one arm wrapped around her shoulders and used his other arm to curl it under her knees. Careful not to jostle her too much, Izuku stood up from his kneeling position on the bathroom tile floor and carried Ochako back into the common space. Her whole body was still shaking and she clutched his shirt with one hand and clung to him using her other arm around his neck. I'm sorry, Deku. Ochako choked out between her horrible shaking. Izuku shook his head and gave her a watery smile. Don't be sorry, this is not your fault. He said in a low whisper, rough with an emotion Ochako had never heard before. She shivered again, although this time it had nothing to do with her dreams or vomiting. It's not yours either. Ochako managed. Izuku looked down at her and gave her a slight squeeze as he carried her. As he reached one of the couches that stood in the center of the room, he shifted Ochako in his grasp and gently laid her down on the soft cushions. I'll be right back, Uraraka, okay? He said in an even softer whisper. She nodded and shifted herself so that she was more comfortable on the couch. He left and returned a moment later with a pillow and a blanket from his own room, which was directly across from the common space. "Here you go," he said softly as he laid the blanket over her. He then kneeled down and used one hand against her upper back to raise her from the couch slightly and used the other to place his pillow under her head. Once she was settled, he walked to the end of her feet and sat down on the couch beside her, one hand resting on the armrest of the couch and his head leaning back into the couch pillows. "Hey, Deku," Ochako asked. Why are you awake right now? Did I wake you?" He paused. "No, you did not wake me, Uraraka. I couldn't sleep. Actually, I haven't been able to sleep in a couple of nights." He replied, his head turned to look out the window. "I haven't been able to sleep properly since you were admitted to the hospital." He rubbed his eyes and yawned widely before looking directly at her. "I have been tossed awake by dreams of you getting hurt, or dreams of me not being able to bring you back. Dreams of being in this world without you." Izuku said, his green eyes filled with something that Ochako could not read. Ochako blushed and turned away from him. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice hoarse and her body still shaking. He did not answer. He just went back to looking out the large windows displaying the views of the dorm courtyard and training areas. They sat in silence for several minutes, Ochako's shaking never ceasing even after finishing her bathroom adventure. Izuku wanted to sleep and he wanted to comfort his friend but felt as if he couldn't do either. He rested his chin on his propped up fist and watched the stars glitter in the sky like baby diamonds. "How long has the vomiting been occurring?" Izuku asked after a few moments, still facing away from her. "Ever since I was admitted to the hospital." She echoed his words from earlier. Izuku turned to look at her, worry lighting his green eyes. "How have you been able to preserve any energy during the day?" he asked. "Lots of coffee and some prescribed medication," Ochako replied. "I've been unable to keep any food down lately, so I've had to have supplements that dissolve more quickly than food so as to keep up my stamina." Ochako's breathing slowed and when Izuku turned to glance at her, he found her dozing, one arm clutching his pillow and the other held close to her chest. She was still shaking hard enough to make the couch tremble, but it must be a good sign that she is starting to sleep, right? Izuku stood up ever so slowly and padded silently past Ochako towards his room to try to get some sleep of his own. He was almost to his door when he heard her stir on the couch and heard the softest sound of Deku whisper across the room. He turned around and walked back to Ochako to see her shaking more violently than before, her eyes wide and filled with fear. I know you're tired, Deku, but could you stay with me tonight? Izuku's heart clenched tightly at her fearful face and the pleading in her voice. Still, he hesitated and swallowed loudly in the dark room before nodding slightly. He went to go sit at the edge of the couch as if to guard her for the night, but Ochako stopped him. I mean, could you come over here? With me. Izuku gulped audibly this time and Ochako blushed. I don't mean anything like that, she whispered. But I just want to feel grounded, to feel like I am here and with someone I care about, she said, her blush growing. Izuku still felt nervous and his heart was a fluttering mess, but he nodded again. Using her elbows, Ochako managed to sit up with a little help from Izuku to make room for him. Izuku laid down on the couch, placing the pillow against the armrest so that it would not poke him in the back of the head all night. Then, once he was settled into a comfortable position, he allowed Ochako to rest her head against his chest, her back pressed against his legs so that they were pinned between her and the back of the couch. Ochako sighed a little and her shaking subsided slightly, her hands curled into light fists against her own chest. Izuku breathed in deeply and tried to calm his wild thoughts as well as his crazy heart as Ochako leaned against him. Suddenly, a car passed by on the road outside, its headlights flashing through the large windows on either side of the front door, and a dull roaring filled the front of the common space as it passed. Although this was a regular occurrence for the students at UA considering there was a popular street right outside of the dorms, Ochako flinched so hard that she groaned as a light pain pulsed through her side. She squirmed to get away from the sound and light of the passing car even though it had already gone past the school and ended up with her back pressed against Izuku's chest and her head nestled into his neck. Izuku froze in surprise at this sudden change but eventually got his composure back. He reached an arm around and curled it over her waist protectively, his own face snuggling into her shoulder. Using his free arm, Izuku pulled his blanket over the top of them. Several awkward minutes passed, but after a time that seemed to take both an eternity and a second, Ochako's breathing slowed to a deep rhythm and her body relaxed against Izuku. She was finally asleep. Izuku felt his brain start to fog up and he sighed contentedly as sleep finally began to overtake his senses. Just before he fell into his must-needed slumber, though, Izuku realized that Ochako had stopped shaking entirely. Blank, underscore, blank. Izuku was barely awake when the bright sun peered through the windows in the early morning. His green eyes fluttered open and the first thing he saw was a mass of brown hair and a beautiful face buried in his neck and chest. His heart shot up into his throat at the sight and the memories from the previous night caused a light pink hue to rush to his cheeks. She looked so peaceful resting against him, so different from how he had found her last night, leaning against the toilet and unable to stand as she threw up everything she had inside of her. He realized that she had shifted her position. Last night she had been facing away from him with her back arched against his chest, but this morning she had flipped so that her face was buried in his neck and her hands had wandered so that one was looped around his neck while the other was pressed against his sternum. Suddenly a loud squeal jolted the pair awake, causing them to leap away from one another. Ochako ended up on the floor and Izuku leapt over the back head of the couch so that he landed with a crash on the edge of the kitchenette. Mina, Ochako asked in horrified shock. What are you doing here? Ochako babbled, her heart still racing with surprise. What am I doing here? Mina asked incredulously. This is our dorm, what are you doing out here on the couch with Midoriya? Nothing. It's not like that, I got sick last night and. Mina started to laugh as Ochako covered her face and activated her quirk on herself, floating high above the room and bouncing off of the tall ceiling. Izuku stood up from the couch, his face such deep red that he looked like an overripe tomato, and held out his arms. Ochako, release your quirk, I'll catch you. Ochako peered at both Mina and Izuku from between her fingers before bringing her shaking hands together to release her quirk. She normally would do a somersault and activate her quirk on herself for half a second when falling from a great height in order to avoid hurting herself, but she was not high enough in the air for her to use that tactic, so she complied. She landed in Izuku's arms with a soft grunt from both of them, and although she was grateful, she sprang from his grasp as if he had burned her, both of their faces bright red under Mina's wide-eyed stare. Ochako mumbled her thanks and the pair tried to part ways and head to their respective bedrooms when Mina lunged for Ochako. Ochako gasped and instinctively leapt out of the way, but the pink alien girl caught her off guard. Izuku turned to go to Ochako, but his floaty friend waved him off with a smile. "I'll see you at lunch," Ochako said cheerfully before turning to follow Mina into her bedroom on one of the upper floors. Izuku watched them go for a minute before turning to walk to his own bedroom. He pushed open the door and gasped as a hand fisted itself into his shirt and yanked him into his room, slamming the door behind him. Where stories live. Discover now.